good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Deborah. I am a professor at the Institute of Computing. So I thank Professor Marisa that is organizing all the seminars this semester. So it's our pleasure to receive today Professor Jesus Favela. Jesus is a professor at the Computer Science Department at CICESE, which is an institution in Mexico. So we have been collaborating for the past 3 years, I think, since 2020, especially in the topic of socially assisted robots. So we have some master and PhD students and also undergrad students working on this topic. And so Professor Jesus' interests include ubiquitous computing, human-computer interaction, and medical informatics. So we'll be very happy to hear your talk about activity and behavior recognition for healthcare and wellness. And Professor Jesus is a partner inside one of the projects that we have, which is supported by CAPES Print. And well, it's a great pleasure to receive you here. Thank you very much for your visit, and we are very happy to hear your talk.
Muito obrigado, Deborah. Boa tarde. I'm going to speak in English, sorry. Thank you for the invitation to talk about the work we've been doing at CICESE in these areas. And I just saw some very interesting work that you're doing in very close related areas, and I think complementary work. So since this is the afternoon and just after lunch, I'm going to start with a quiz to wake you up. So Sunday I learned about tennis beach. I didn't know that existed. It seems like a lot of fun. So the question is as follows. What did I say? Tennis beach. Beach tennis, yeah, okay. So let's say a racket and a ball costs $1.10. The racket costs $1 more than the ball. And the question is, what is the cost of the ball? So you have 5 seconds to think about it. Okay. Some of you think it's 10 cents, perhaps? No one? Oh, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Yeah, that's the wrong answer, actually. But when this test or a similar test without the beach was applied in universities in the US, most people got it wrong. And the reason they got it wrong, I'm not going to give the correct answer, I think most of you already know it, is that this is what Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, in behavioral economics, called slow thinking, fast thinking problem. So there is an apparent solution, a sort of easy solution, which is 10 cents. And this is the first thing that comes to mind. And when you have an easy solution, you just go with it. You don't think too much about it. You don't state an equation or something to solve the problem. Actually, I just tried yesterday with ChatGPT to see if it got it right. And it got it right. So it actually explains, puts the formula and explains what the correct answer is. This is a problem that normally a robot, a computer won't get wrong, because it'll just do the calculation very easily. But many people, as I told you, about half the human population will get it wrong. So this is in a way an interesting problem to identify if you're talking to a computer or you're talking to a person. So I'll go back to the Turing test. So you're familiar, of course, with the Turing test, in which you have someone typing with an entity, doesn't know if it's a computer or a person, and the computer tries to simulate that it's a person. And if half the time you get it wrong, then you pass the Turing test, and the computer can simulate the person. So I'm going to talk about what I call an alternative Turing test, in which the judge is no longer a person, but it's a computer, and it's using information from a variety of sensors to identify not the person itself, but its health condition, its trajectory on a disease, for instance, or to diagnose some types of diseases. This problem has become interesting as our life becomes increasingly digital. And the pandemic just made a big step in that direction. So since the pandemic, in particular during the pandemic, we spend a lot of time interacting and working on computers. So before, we used to go and have coffee with friends. Now we go and have coffee with friends, but with our cell phones all the time. This is an interesting example because as these e-readers have become popular, such as the Amazon Kindle, there's a lot of information. I was once reading an article of the amount of information that Amazon gets from us every time we pass to the next page. How many seconds you spend there? What's the time of the day when you press the to the next page? If you first went to the previous page, so there's a lot of information collecting about it. And an author, for instance, can know at what parts of the text that people read more quickly, or at what parts of the text people just stop reading the novel, or stuff like that. And of course, smartwatches and Fitbit bands have been trying to do recognition of sleep patterns and sleep quality with some degree of accuracy, better in some aspects than others. I come from the field of ubiquitous computing, and in its early stages, I don't know, 25 plus years ago, there was a lot of interest in context-aware computing. You know? So the idea is to have information about your environment, where are you, with whom you are, to adapt the application to your interests and needs. So location is the prime example. Nowadays, most of our applications in our cell phone make use of our location. Sometimes you download a new app, a game or whatever, and it asks you if you can share the location, and you wonder, why would this game need my location? But many of them do in some way or another, perhaps for announcements or for some other reason. But location-aware computing has been a reality for 10 plus years, at least since the start of the smartphones. And there was a lot of research on that topic some years ago in ubiquitous computing. After that, it became popular to work on activity recognition, particularly these fitness trackers. This is the first version of the Fitbit with an accelerometer, gyroscope, and in later versions, an altimeter to measure if you're just walking or taking steps. And the application was rather simple. It's just how many steps you take, how many, perhaps if you're running, or a little more sophisticated than that, but not much more. But the whole industry was created around that, no? The health monitoring applications and stuff. And I'm going to also be talking about behavior, which is sort of the next frontier where a lot of research in UBCOM recognition is done. So in the same line as location, walking, an interesting behavior, for instance, is wandering. This is an important behavior, for instance, for people with dementia that might get lost if they start wandering. And this is a more complicated problem than it seems, because there are many types of wandering. So for instance, one type of wandering is just walking and coming back. And this could be disturbing for someone who's interacting with the older adult, but he's actually making exercise. This is a healthy behavior. But there's also another type of wandering in which I just go out and get lost in the city, take a bus or whatever. So if you can identify, because the person is wearing a smartwatch or something, that the person is lost and you can locate him, that's an interesting application. So I'm talking about this in the intersection of three fields. This is where I come from, ubiquitous computing, Internet of Things. This is, nowadays, I was just last week hearing a keynote from Elizabeth Minett, who is one of the pioneers of UBCOM, and she was saying, now I'm working on AI. And ubiquitous computing is now, has been collecting data about people from the smartwatches, so that's what this is contributing, let's say, to the field. On the other hand, of course, is artificial intelligence, statistics, data mining to make sense of that data, and applications, in particular in the health and behavioral science. There are some other fields, but this is one of the dominant fields at this intersection. What has changed in a relatively few years is that we now have massive data. Before, just collecting a data set from a few, 20, 40 people, that was considered adequate, not anymore. There are studies of 100,000 people, for instance, using wearables, stuff like that. Of course, there's been a significant advances in these techniques. Actually, not so much in the techniques from deep learning. Of course, there's been some interesting advances, not mostly in the hardware, and because of the availability of massive amount of wellness. And one of the frontiers as well in the case of healthcare is personalized healthcare. So can we adapt these technologies to your specific profile, to the specific trajectory of the disease as it affects you and not another person who has the same disease? We have like sort of two views of the same problem. I'm going to mostly talk about activity or behavior recognition. We obtain information from sensors, my smartwatch, stuff in my house when I open the water, or how I affect the electromagnetic signal as the work you're doing here, to identify context and activities. But it's also interesting to identify regular patterns of behaviors. This could be individual. I mean, I normally wake up at, 7 a.m. And someday on a weekday, it's strange because it's 8:30 and I haven't woke up. So that's probably an interesting, this could be personal, or it could be shared, the pattern of a population. So comparing my current behavior with my pattern or the pattern of everyone is interesting in many regards. For instance, to discover that I might be having early signs of disease. Okay. And behavior is particularly interesting since we can artificially do some activities. For instance, a physician tells us to do some walking, and we do some walking because someone tells us, because we want to make sure that he sees us doing the activity. But behavior many times is not directed at others. So it's innate, it's not it's not meant to give a message to other people, but we unconsciously do it. For instance, when we are sweating because we get nervous, that's difficult to control, or to control our heart rate. I mean, we do some breathing, but not much more than that. So in that regard, behavior is interesting. So this technology is having an interesting impact, and I'm sure it's going to have more in the future on epidemiology. Epidemiology was actually started in the middle of the 19th century with the famous case of cholera in the UK, when they started having several cases of cholera and people were dying. And this person, John Snow, went and mapped the location of where people lived who had cholera. And from that, this is probably one of the earliest examples of data mining. He proposed that the water was the cause of the cholera. And of course, the biology was not developed sufficiently to convince people that this was true. He died, and there was already not sufficient advances in biology to make sure that his hypothesis was true. But it turned out to be true. And it was a problem with the water sources that created this cholera. 1 century later, in the middle of the 20th century, this study started, the Framingham study, which is probably the most important and longest running epidemiological study in the world. They took a standard city in Massachusetts in the US, and they have been studying it for more than 50 years, 50, 60 years. Using many different instruments. At the beginning, they were only mapping male adults. Nowadays, they are doing studies on the grandchildren of those who participated in the original study. They include kids, and they now also take DNA samples. They also get monitoring data from their smart watches and all that. And this has been a very important epidemiological study. A more recent study, this was conducted in San Francisco like 7-8 years ago by a group of researchers led by Sandy Penton from MIT. And it actually corrected one result from the Framingham study. So the Framingham study, about 15 or 20 years ago, stated that according to their data, your family and friends have a strong influence on your healthy or unhealthy habits. So if your friends smoke, more probably you're going to smoke, or your family. If your friends or family is obese, most probably you're going to be obese. And the correction they made with this is a smaller study, only in the city of San Francisco, but using wearable sensors, was that it's not your friends or family, it's the people you spend most time with who have that influence. So you could be all day working on a lab next to someone that you don't consider your friend. You say hello every morning, whatever, but you're not considering your friend. But that person has more influence on you than your family, for instance. And this has been as longer or more ambitious epidemiological studies are being conducted. They are now incorporated this type of sensors, particularly wearable sensors, smart watches and modifications of that. So one nice example is the Precision Medicine Initiative, which started in the US now like 7 years ago or so, in which they are collecting information from 1 million US citizens, all kinds of information, clinical, DNA, and behavioral data from these types of sensors. Okay. So the evolution of data gathering in terms of the sensing technology. At the beginning, they were using accelerometers, like this box on your pants, with a PDA, so low capacity computer, basically just to gather data. Very basic processing was done on that. No actual processing of the signals, so it's just gathering data to identify if the person was standing or walking, or simple things like that. This was another very sort of elaborate sensor that was built at the Media Lab at MIT, which has a microphone, an accelerometer, and infrared signal to see if you're facing another person who is wearing this sociometer, was called. A few years later, with the start of the smartphones, we incorporated a few interesting sensors, particularly the accelerometer. But now everyone, well, in a few years, not in 2007, but a few years after, pretty much everyone was having one. So the technology became pervasive, and it became feasible to conduct studies with hundreds of people, with thousands of people. And there's been some interesting advances. In particular, the smartwatch is interesting. It's not as widespread. There are not so many people that have smartwatches as compared to smartphones. But they are in contact with your skin, so you can measure heart rate, for instance, and get more accurate measures of sleep, as an example. And you know the location of the smartwatch, so it's in your dominant hand normally. Whether your smartphone might be in your pant, might be in your purse, might be on the desk. So that's some advantage. And the ubiquity of this smart microphone is also making allowing to collect interesting data. You can see the sensing campaigns to gather activity or behavioral data in two dimensions. On the one hand is the scale. You can do it for an individual, just collect data from that person, a group, or a community. For instance, in epidemiology, we'll be working with a community. And you have two types of sensing, participatory and opportunistic sensing. In participatory sensing, you're asking the person for the information. So for instance, you do momentary assessment. You every so often or at random times, you send a message to the person asking them to answer, I'm feeling healthy, I don't know, I'm tired or whatever. And in opportunistic sensing, you're just collecting data from sensors without the participation of the individual. So in terms of epidemiology, the opportunity is on doing large-scale sensing, mostly opportunistic, but perhaps with some ground data coming from participatory sensing. So yes, I actually arrived home from walking, or I just went up the stairs. Now, what type of information might be interesting in healthcare? Let me start with some of the most basic and simple things. One of them is life space. This group from the University of Nebraska started just measuring life space. Life space is the longest distance you travel in a day. So if you take your bed as 0.0, coordinate 0, perhaps you only went to the bathroom. So that's a signal of variety. So on the whole day you never left home. Even worse than that, you never left your bed. So perhaps you're very frail, perhaps you're very sick, very probably, or you're very tired. You were able to go on your own to the bathroom. So you traveled a slightly longer distance. Or you left home and went to the school. Or you traveled to China or around the world. So that measure, it's a very simple measure. We can collect this data with any smartphone very easily. Actually, Google and Apple collects this data all the time from us. Is related to our health status, and this has been, this concept has been identified in geriatric medicine for a number of years. Another is just the amount of activity that you make during the day. How many periods of intense activity, of regular activity. And again, even an approximate measure is good enough to assess the health status of the person. Regarding behavior, if you're interested in these topics, I would strongly recommend this book, Honest Signals, from Alex Penton. It's already 10 or so years old. He has conducted a number of studies in the field, and he identified these 4 signals that he called honest signals. Honest signals because we cannot control them. Well, or it's very difficult to control them. So it tells us a lot about what's happening or what the status of the person is in different circumstances without you trying to lie to the other person. For instance, consistency, which is the fluidity of speech and motion, we perceive that as expertise. So if someone, and actually this is a good example of that. This is one of the studies they conducted. This is from what's called an entrepreneurship contest that they conduct at MIT, where they have different participants presenting their business plan, and they have a board of people who will select the best business plans, and they will give money to them. So actually, the ones in green are the ones that were chosen, and they receive money. And these measures was information about consistency and activity. So the interest and an amount of expertise that you perceive on the person, regardless of what they are speaking. So in this measure, you have absolutely no idea what the business plan is about, but just the way the person presents and the way the person talks. He looks like an expert in the field, and he looks really convinced that. And there was a very strong match between the projects that were selected. These were selected by experts who read the business plan, etc. And it just coincided perfectly with what the algorithm would suggest. So this means that it doesn't matter what you say, as long as you seem to be an expert in the field, and people will believe you, and you can sell anything to anyone, but you have to believe in yourself. I'm gonna skip this one. This is an interesting example, and it might be interesting for the work you're doing, because this is work that was done in Germany, in which they put different sensors. And one of the interesting things about this work is that they try to emulate a common test in healthcare, in particular for older adults, which is called the dog test for stand up and go. So in this in this test, what you do is you put a chair, which actually has to have very specific measures, back or not back, without hand support, etc. And you just tell the people to stand up, walk, I don't know, 10 meters or something like that, come back and sit down. And you just measure the amount of time it takes them to complete that task. It's a very simple task. It can be done at any office, clinician's office. And if you do that, I don't remember the measure, but in less than 10 seconds or something like that, then it's a sign of priority. So you perhaps have something wrong and you do some additional testing. So what they did is they put these sensors in an apartment, and they just measured people working on a day-to-day, on a normal day-to-day basis. But they control which trajectories were worth measuring. So you have to walk more or less on a straight line for at least some amount of distance. So if I'm just moving around in this area, it's not of interest, and I'm not going to try to compare with the standard test. So one interesting area of research in general is taking common tests done in healthcare for a number of conditions and trying to perform that on a naturalistic environment. Because when I go to the doctor and they ask me to do this, I'm probably going to try my best. And I'm going to the doctor perhaps once a year or twice a year. Whether we can do these measures many times a day. So even if there's some error, and of course sometimes I walk faster than other times, the fact that you have this continuous measurement, it gives you a much better idea of what's going on. Oh, no. This is an example of, this is the type of, well, this is in Spanish, but these are the type of questions that are asked to a person to assess priority. For instance, how many, in the last week, in the last 7 days, for how many times, how many of those days you walked continuously for at least 10 minutes? So this is an easy question to answer for many people, but a difficult one for others. So if I live 20 minutes from here and I always walk to the school, easy. Every day I walk at least 10 minutes. But for some of us, it's not that easy to add. Also, sometimes we want to lie, right? Because perhaps I just, maybe 1 or 2 times a week, but I'm going to say 5 because I don't want the doctor to think I'm so lazy. Or the other way around. I want to look frail to the doctor because I want him to think that I need some medicine or whatever. So again, this is something very easy to measure nowadays. How many times you spend sitting on a regular day? And I think I had some other ones. How much you talk with friends or family? Also, that's something that we can be measuring without much problem. Well, this is a study we conducted with other adults a few years ago, but this is an interesting example. So in the questionnaire, when we asked this particular person the amount of moderate and intense activity that they performed in the day, for instance, they answered that moderate activity is equivalent of walking. So if I walk, I'm doing moderate activity. If I'm cycling, I'm doing intense activity. So this person said that he does 5 hours of moderate activity equivalent to walking every day. The last 7 days, which of course is not true, is exaggerated. And this is the information we collected with that person. These activity bouts are actually 10-minute periods of the activity. She had 300 periods of light activity, but 0 periods of continuous moderate activity. And actually, this is the darker green. There's some here. So it has some spots of moderate activity, which is probably walking or something like that, but never 10 minutes of continuous moderate activity. So there's some reliability issues in the questionnaires we normally apply for those conditions. And these are just some examples of some very basic information we can easily gather from people. So a lot of my work has been in working with people with dementia and older adults in general. And this is an interesting problem because many times people that suffer from dementia have, let's say, strange behaviors or non-typical behaviors, right? And they also, and actually the treatment, so as far as we know today, the condition of particularly, for instance, Alzheimer's is non-reversible. The type of medicine you take is basically to address psychological symptoms of dementia, not to cure Alzheimer's. It cannot be cured, at least as far as we know. So when you take medicine, it's to deal with anxiety, with depression, with some of the symptoms that some people have. Maybe 80 to 90% have some of these symptoms, but some might have anxiety and another one have depression, or maybe someone has both of them. So identifying those periods, those behaviors, is of interest to make interventions and also to understand the trajectory of the disease. So for instance, the person is deteriorating rapidly, or therapeutic intervention is working and these conditions are improving. Okay, so we propose this model called ambient-assisted interventions. You have the person with dementia, you have the caregiver. There's some activity or behavior analysis and recognition done on the individual, but perhaps also the caregiver who observes some behavior can also report that behavior. So my grandmother is feeling anxious. And then you can act on the environment to do something about it, to try to address those behaviors. Let me give you a very simple example that comes from actual interviews with the daughter of a lady who suffered from dementia. I've of course modified the names and a little bit, but this lady would be in the late afternoon watching TV with her daughter or a caregiver. And suddenly, with no much explanation at all, she stands up, she goes to her room, takes luggage, and starts putting her clothes on the luggage. And the caregiver or the daughter says, "Mother, what are you doing?" And she would answer, "It's getting late, I'm going home." So this is a symptom known as sundowning. So when the light goes down, they fail to recognize. It has to do also with the visual acuity. So when there's less light in the room, they do not recognize where they are, and they feel that it's getting late and they have to go home. And in this particular case, she does that, or she used to do that. This was done several years ago, perhaps 2 or 3 times a week. So this is very often. So the daughter would explain to her, "No, you're already home, Ma, don't worry. No, I have to go home." Sometimes she would go out around the block for a walk and come back to the house, and the mother is less anxious and nothing happens. One solution for sundowning is just to increase lighting. And this is something we could do with technology very easily. So the light comes down in the afternoon. We sense that she's getting anxious, and we just increase the lighting, and the problem might go away with something as simple. Okay, so based on this, we did an intervention at the time using smartphones and displays, and we conducted studies with two people that evaluated this for a month or half a month, and we detected a decrease in psychological symptoms of dementia, and a decrease in caregiver overload, just the amount of stress that the caregiver is having. And from the interviews with the caregivers, we also got some positive results of that particular intervention. So it would have been interesting. At the time, we don't have the technology to actually measure those changes in behavior. We did it through the caregiver who completed some questionnaires, but now the technology is getting closer to allowing us to do that. We've also done some work with boys and some type of psychological symptoms of depression is what's called vocally disruptive behavior. So they start yelling, they start crying. singing, which is not necessarily disruptive unless there's someone trying to sleep next to you and you're singing. So we collected some data in a residence from 5 people, and we observed these symptoms. This was during 4 weeks. We went every other day in the weekday and collected audio data from 5 hours, and by observation we collected some of the symptoms. This is an example, perhaps. Well, the audio is not that interesting, but this is an interaction between 2 ladies, and one of them normally mumbles. She starts doing something like that, and the other one starts saying silence, shut up. She's a Mexican American, so she sometimes speaks in Spanish, sometimes speaks in English, and so she starts yelling at the other one, and she increases this behavior, right? So the idea is to be able to identify these behaviors and to try to distract one of them for that. But that's the audio. So one of the interesting things about this is in the more than 100 hours of data that we studied, for instance, one of these ladies would mumble and yell more than once per hour. So this is a strange behavior perhaps for us, but this is a very common behavior for them. And we did the traditional machine learning stuff to try to identify with some degree of success using different classifiers, and that's not so important. Another interesting problem in older adults is the loss of muscle strength. So as we age, we lose muscle strength. This is muscle strength. This is unavoidable. Perhaps slower some of us, perhaps quicker. And this is an important condition because this increases our probability of falling down and getting into some accidents. So again, perhaps you go once every 6 months to the doctor, and they'll use a dynamometer to measure your strength. Normally they do it with a hand dynamometer, but your muscle strength usually is somewhat correlated. You perhaps have better muscle strength in your legs because you walk more than what you do with your hands, but it's somewhat correlated, and so they normally do that. So the idea again here is to collect perhaps less precise data, but with higher frequency. So you're not using a medical device in the lab of your doctor, because you can have this behavior. So if you go every 6 months, he can think that the condition is stable or increasing. But this could be just fluctuations in the signal. And as it happens, this is actually the one that's stable, and this is the one that's increasing. But depending on the days that you got the measurement, looks like this one is stable. So in that case, we did a serious game in which you use a dynamometer, which you control. For instance, this is to calibrate, just to make some juice to calibrate the device by pressing on some oranges, since each of us have different arm strength to begin with. And you might remember this game. I don't know if it's still being used, but it's Angry Birds, in which you take the bird and let it go. And so you start playing with it without actually exercising too much strength, but at some points it'll ask you to exercise maximum strength, and those are the measurements that are taken. So the idea is to have like a game in which you're making some of these measurements on a very regular basis. Perhaps not every day, but perhaps once a week, a couple of times a month. One of the areas on activity recognition related to healthcare that it's like the holy grail is to get a sense of what you're eating. And there are many approaches to that. Many of those involve just taking a picture of your meal and having an estimation of the number of calories and how healthy is whatever you're eating. So here we tried different crowdsourcing approaches to have people actually contributing to this labeling, which is a very important aspect of creating these data sets for behavior and activity recognition, the actual labeling from experts. So what you do is you receive a number of images of the food, and you select what's closer to the meal that's being shown in the picture, and in that way we get a better description of what the person is eating and how healthy or the number of calories. So it's a human plus machine approach. This is the work in which we're collaborating on social robots. So in this model I described before, so some of the intervention can be actually done by a robot. Let me show you. Oh, the audio is not going to come up very nicely, but this is, I'll describe this interaction. Oh, actually there's text, so you can probably read the text. So this is a therapy in which 3 people who suffer from dementia in a geriatric home are interacting with the robot. And let me wait. I don't think you can hear it, right? But, perhaps you can read it. So they are talking about the fruit they like to eat. They said that they all like mangoes. I don't know if this has the same meaning here, but mango. So that someone is a mango, it means that she's a beautiful person or something like that? Oh, okay, that she has a nice body. So it's okay. So this lady is saying, we are 3 mangoes, like 3 mangoes. Okay, let me get back a little bit.
Somos 3 mangos. Ay, Dios mío. Ojalá que sí se llegue a realizar eso.
Lástima que yo no puedo comer nada de eso.
¿Por qué? Si el mango es una fruta muy rica, ¿por qué el mango no lo puedes comer? Sí se puede, ¿sabes?
Porque soy un robot.
So this is the type of interventions that we conducted for 3 years, and these are results from the last intervention, which was a cognitive stimulation therapy in which the robot was acting autonomously. Actually, the video you saw was Wizard of Oz. The student was typing what the robot was saying. But with this last intervention, we keep 10 people, 15 sessions, 1 or 2 a week, and they also wore smart watches during most of during the intervention, except for one person who, more at the middle of, was always taking the smartwatch out, so we took it from them. And so we measured the symptoms of dementia from interviews and from questionnaires filled by the caregivers. And what you see in green is it's an improvement. The rate goes from 1 to 4, when 1 means rare and 4 means very often. So they, for instance, they have anxiety very often if they have 4. So, for instance, a measure of 2 means that they went from very often to sometimes, or from often to rarely. So we can see that most of them had a positive impact, except for P5, who was mixed results. Some things improved, some other things were worse. And data from the sensor, we got some interesting information, for instance, about night sleep versus day sleep. So this is the 5 people for which we have sufficient data. So 4 of them slept more time at night and less time during the day. This could be an example. In days of therapy, they slept about 9 hours versus 8 hours when they had no therapy. And only one day when they had therapy, she slept in the afternoon for 1 hour versus 9 days of those without therapy, where she slept for 2 hours. And in the interviews, this was a mixed method approach. In the interviews, one of the caregivers actually talking about this person said, I noticed that on the days of the session If the robot did not go to her room to take an afternoon nap, she was more active. So apparently the intervention was effective in that regard. I think I'm also running out of time. We've been collecting audio data with a geriatric doctor to try to classify people with dementia, mild cognitive impairment, and healthy older adults. So the results, if you're interested, I can talk to you later. This was one of the projects I was talking to you the other day. And finally, I think this is the last one. This is work from a colleague of mine who has been doing a lot of work on autism. So they developed this application in which it's a relatively simple application in which you play with a spider, you move it around and by touching on the screen. And they are measuring a number of tactile gestures with a device. They collected data from 19 children with autism and 36 neurotypical children. And an analysis of the results found two digital biomarkers. So two measures of the interaction with the device that more or less clearly classified children with autism with those without autism. And one of those, for instance, is the radius of the gesture. So how the area you cover when you make a gesture on the screen. Apparently, for children with autism, it's smaller the area that they covered. And the other one was the amplitude of the vibration recorded by the accelerometer. So this is still ongoing work. Since you're also working with children with autism, I thought I'd talk a little bit about that. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much for your patience. And I'll be happy to take questions if we have time for that.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jesus, for your presentation. Do you have questions?
I have a question about the sensors that you typically use. You mentioned some people removing their bands. One of the elderly people removing the band because it was monitored and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that people that, when they know that they are being monitored, they tweak the system, they try to behave differently?
No, not in that case. There's been studies in which they do that. For instance, in many companies in the US, they give them for free. The health insurance company that will give them for free to them, and they make some contests to see who walks the most, and some people put them in their cage of their hamster. No, because the people who participated in these interventions have mild to moderate dementia, so they're not. But he just felt it was uncomfortable, and at some point it got lost, the device, and they found it in the washing machine. Apparently, put it in some of the clothes of the person. So at some point we decided it was. I think it was a male. I think he was uncomfortable with it, and we decided to take it out.
When they are doing an exam or they approach the doctor and so on, they do not sleep or they change their behavior, right?
Yeah.
So do you think that if they did not know that they are being monitored, the results would be more accurate?
In general, they do, but this intervention lasted for, I don't know, 12 weeks or so. So when enough time passes, perhaps in some cases, what you could do is ignore, for instance, the first few days of data. Sorry, there it lasted, well, 15 sessions. Yeah, it was like 10 weeks or so. So at some point, you just, we told them they were watches for them to look at the hour or something like that. It was,
They did not know their being.
no, we got permission from their relatives. They wouldn't be on a condition to understand that they were being monitored, or they would forget quickly. They had some relatively advanced stages of dementia. They were verbal, they were active, they could walk and things like that. for instance, when every time we took or sometimes when we took the robot there, when the student was installing the robot, he would ask, "Do you remember Eva? He came again to visit you," and one would say, "Oh yeah, I think she came like a month ago or so," when they actually came 3 days before. So they had a sense that they've been in similar, and that also worked with the therapies because the therapies also involved some music, for instance, and the robot would ask them about a couple of options for music, and it was all almost the same. There was very little variation, but they didn't got bored about it because they forgot that two days ago they were singing the same song or they were being told the same thing or very similar stuff by the robot. Actually, there was one in the last intervention that there was one person who was reluctant to go in the last 2 sessions and actually didn't go to the not the last one, but the one before the last one. And his argument to the caregiver was, "I got bored of listening to this lady sing the same." He was not referring to the robot, but for another participant who was gonna sing the same song. So he was conscious that this was being repetitive, but he was the only one. So yeah, something like this would work in a spectrum in a period of the disease, let's say, a stage of the disease.
Second question is about the scale of the experiments and so on. Usually, we have small groups,
Yep.
right? And it's very hard to reproduce the same experiment with different techniques because
Yep.
the groups are not the same. So, how do you think about this challenge of not having enough data, or not having enough a good benchmark to test different techniques and so on? Because you know that we are building this data set right now. We have like 150 people in our data set, but still people complain that, oh, this is only in one room. And then we have 17 different positions there, and they still complain that, oh, these are very controlled environment and so on.
Yep.
So it seems like it's never good enough. So my point is, many times it's a good experiment and it's not conclusive. Or you cannot argue, or people cannot argue that you are conclusive because it's a small group, or you have a.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question and a common complaint from the reviewers to our papers. There's a saying in dementia that says, when you meet one person with dementia, you know one person with dementia. That everyone experiences the disease differently. So we argue a little bit about that. I mean that even when you conduct the same experiment with the same person a year later or a few months later, they might have changed. This is actually what happened with P5. P5 had been participating at least in the previous year. And when we started this intervention, the student noticed that she was behaving differently. And they told us that in the last few months, she started getting medication because he was being so very anxious. So she was actually the one in the video in the middle. Her. She was very active with the robot, and in the last year, she was very passive. But what we found in her case, which was interesting, is from the accelerometer data, we noticed that after the intervention, or around the time of the intervention, the days of the intervention, her activity increases. So she takes the medication in the morning, and so she's very passive. She doesn't walk that much. The actigraphy that we recorded is very mild, and on the days of the intervention, it recovers more quickly. On normal days, it recovers, but much more slowly. So this is one data point from one person, and it's difficult to find. So we try to argue that with the reviewers. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. I understand the concern, and yeah, we're all dealing with that.
We all face the same challenges.
Yeah.
My English is so the video is Ella.
Ajá. Sí, sí. Yeah, here.
Yeah. It changed very much.
The version, the different versions. Yeah. Actually, this is another version. The one over here. And yeah, actually, the first version, it was ridiculously simple. So the body was from yogurt, they painted in white, and it evolved a little bit. Yeah, it changed. Yeah, it had pretty much the same hardware inside, but the physical appearance it improved a little.
What challenge you
Foresee?
você encontrou que o vídeo ele trata a terapia, pode falar comigo?
Durante.
No vídeo ele mostra a terapia funcionando com ela. A gente trabalha com ela tem scripts. E esse script ele não faz em forma de jogo, ele faz uma forma de conversação. Tipo assim, qual a sua fruta favorita? Aí eles deram input e responde. Tipo assim, qual o desafio que ele encontrou em fazer esses scripts? Não sei se foi ele que fez. Ou se foi outra pessoa.
Well, we say that usually when we program for the evil robot, we develop some kind of scripts with questions and answers. So the robot says something and it expects the user to answer something. So when you developed this idea, probably with Dago, what were the biggest challenges that you faced for building this kind of interactions, like having questions and answers and expecting a certain kind of answer from the user? Were there challenges in designing the way the robot behaves?
Yeah, we ended up collecting information. So we learned in each year, we learned a little bit more and what worked and what didn't work. And in general and specific for each person. So for instance, in the group interventions, we asked the caregivers to give us groups of people that get along among each other. So we didn't want two people fighting in the middle of the therapy. So just to give you a very simple example. So we collected information about the type of music they like and a few additional information on each individual. So at some point we created an ontology of the person. So for instance, I know you were born in some place, and I know that you like feijoada and churrasco. Okay. So Eva would ask you, what do you like to eat in Minas Gerais? And you say something different that Eva has never heard before. Okay, so it provides a general answer. It doesn't try to understand what I mean. If it's not feijoada, she'll say something generic. But then when we do the log when we have the log, we do a post-mortem analysis of the session. And in the log, we now he said some new dish, hamburger. So we add in the ontology that. So we now know that you like churrasco, feijoada, and hamburgers. And it's probably in a future session, you would say hamburger as well. But what worked actually, I mean, you can repeat many of the same, with small variations. They would always enjoy the same music, even if they sang that music 2 days ago. Another part of the personalization was we got some idea of what type of questions they could ask. For instance, regarding music, there were a few people that we could ask a general question like, what song you want to hear? In general, it's a difficult question to answer because you start thinking too much, and even for us, it's perhaps this or that, I don't know. Another is which song you want to hear from this singer or from this composer. So it's a little more constrained, it's a little easier to answer. Or I can give you, what do you want, choice 1 or choice 2? So it's an easier way. And there's some people that even if you provide them with 2 choices, they get stuck and they cannot answer that question. So for that, people will say, I know you like Garota de Ipanema. So I'm just saying that song for you. Okay. So that was part of the personalization. We more recently got Eva connected with ChatGPT. And we got some very interesting results because we just create a prompt with information about the person, what topics they like to talk about, even what topics Eva should not talk about at all because they get angry if they start talking about money or or soccer or whatever. They get too anxious, for instance. And it works surprisingly well. And I'm amazed that we haven't tried yet with people with dementia. We want to do that next. But when I showed this to Dago, who worked on the original version of Eva, he was amazed. Like, I did so much work by hand for so many years, and this thing does much better with just calling the API and yeah. So that's the sad thing of doing research in these areas, that things move so quickly. Thank you.
Very good. Have you done any individual sessions with the elderly people, or they were always in groups?
2 or 3, not individual. But this one we want to do it individually because we want to just concentrate on a conversation with one person. Yeah. Yeah. And for instance, it was very difficult. One of the problems was that they would be talking at the same time. So we had some conversational breakdowns because of that. But they sort of
with each other and
yeah, but the interaction between them helped. For instance, one thing we noticed is that some people, when there was a new person in the group, the other two would help him. They would describe, "Oh, this is a robot," and whatever. So that was nice.
Okay, so we have any questions from the audience?
I have a question from the audience online, but they are thinking about your great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let's thank Professor Jesus.
So,